Welcome back to Sermon Rewind. My name is Jordan. I'm the pastor here at Bethany Christian Reformed Church, and as usual, what a privilege it is to not only look back to the sermon from the previous Sunday, but also to look forward to some of the questions that you, the viewer, have. We're still in the book of Acts, as we have been for a while, in chapter 21 this past week, visiting verses 1 through 14. Paul has made it clear in his missionary journeys, his final missionary journey for that matter, that he is inevitably going to somehow make his way both to Jerusalem and to Rome. And so as he's kind of making these last final stops, the Holy Spirit begins to speak to a handful of disciples and friends of his, as well as a localized prophet, to inform him and everyone around him just how severe it's going to be when he eventually does. And so there's an interesting dialogue that takes place between these two groups of people with Paul that gives us a very unique impression about what it is not only that Paul must do, but what it means for us, even today, to be fully surrendered and committed to the call on our lives in Jesus. The big idea from this last Sunday is important, I think, for all of us to wrap our hearts and minds around, and it is simply this, that a surrendered life, particularly one to Jesus, is the only life worth living. Meaning, there is no Christian life where you kind of have one foot in and one foot out. There is no Christian life where you express belief with your lips, but your life is not surrendered to it. No, a surrendered, all-in life laid down at the cross of Jesus to be utilized by our King however he is pleased to do so is the only life worth living. Now, what's interesting in this text is that the Holy Spirit speaks both to these friends of his as well as this prophet in such a way that gives us the impression that he's appealing to Paul to not go. And yet Paul seems determined to go. So there's been a question for many, many years now that has been wrestled with by many theologians, people far smarter than me, about whether or not Paul was being disobedient or if we interpret what was actually happening in these texts wrongly. So there was an interesting question that came up, and I knew it was going to, and it reads this way. How do we reconcile the fact that the Holy Spirit was talking to Paul, leading him to Jerusalem, and also talking to Paul's friends, but warning him not to go? Why would the Holy Spirit speak to both sides, seemingly contradicting each other? Is this just their interpretation of the passage, or is there something else going on? The best way to wrestle through this question is as follows. Richard Longnecker is a well-respected theologian and biblical scholar, and he says, with regard to verse 4, these words, "We should understand the preposition dia, which means through, as meaning that the Spirit's message was the occasion for the believer's concern, rather than that their trying to dissuade Paul was directly inspired by the Holy Spirit." Another way of saying it, John Stott hops in. Perhaps Luke's statement is a condensed way of saying that the warning was divine while the urging was human. Now, I realize that these theologians aren't necessarily the authority on all things, but I think they're getting to the bottom of what many of us are trying to understand. Was this the Holy Spirit appealing to Paul not to go? Or was this the Holy Spirit revealing to these disciples that when Paul goes, things are going to get bad for them, and their urgency as his friends, people that love him, was for him rather to stay back and save his life? I mean, think of all of the wonderful things for God he could do if Paul lived another 10, 20, 30 years, right? It's a rational, normal thing for friends to do. The reality, however, beckons back to the big idea of the sermon. And what Paul understood, and hopefully we understand as well, that a surrendered life to Jesus, whatever may come, is the only life worth living for the Christian. Paul in chapter 20 talks about the fact that the only thing he knows about his life is that he is going to eventually go somewhere where there is going to be suffering and chains for him. He knows that's coming. He expects it. He's eager for it in some ways. And he is reconciled that this is how his life will be used for the glory of God and the good of God's people. So he surrenders his life to the notion. This does not mean, I don't think, that there is a contradiction taking place. The Holy Spirit obviously revealed what was coming in Jerusalem to a handful of people because Paul himself did not, which means that they were privy to information. However, as you watch Acts unfold, you will continue to know that the Holy Spirit led Paul to Jerusalem for his glory, led him through the arrest that will soon come and the handing over to the Gentiles so that God's ultimate purposes in the gospel would be made known, not only all throughout Europe, but through his writings, through his suffering, and through his testimony, through millions upon millions the world over. It's a difficult text. It's difficult to reconcile. But if you could walk away with this with anything, let it be this. A surrendered life to Jesus is not only the life worth living for us because it is good and it is faithful, but because God intends to use surrendered lives to spread his message and his glory all throughout the globe. So be encouraged, join in the same life, and may God continue to bless you and the people that you love around you. We hope to see you soon.